So I want to welcome Pastor Carel Smith and Dr. Willie McLeod back to our podcast on the topic of Genesis. We've now discussed the Garden of Eden. We've looked at Adam, and what we're looking at today or discussing is one of my absolute favorite topics, and that is the Book of Enoch. Now, prior to the podcast and just preparing for it, I was reading an article by Willie called the Sumerian Eternal, translated as the Biblical Enoch. And I actually, as a starting point, just wanted to read the first paragraph. Willie actually says the Biblical Enoch corresponds to a remarkable degree with the figure of Eternal in Sumerian tradition. It seems reasonable to assume that they belong to the same original tradition handed down in the stories about Enoch and those about Eternal, respectively. Their stories are in fact not the only ones showing close agreement between stories from Sumerian tradition and stories from biblical tradition. Now, I've done a lot of reading on the Book of Enoch, and it's as I said, one of my favorite topics, but I've never sort of looked at it from the Sumerian perspective. So, Willie, I'm going to hand over to you. Can you sort of use that as a bit of a starting point for us?
Yeah, Levi. We have been discussing the early, the primeval history, as it's called. That is Genesis 1 to 11, and we've discussed the garden story, or various elements of the story, and the first offerings. And I think now the next important person in biblical tradition and the Genesis is the figure of Enoch. After that is the flood, and I think next week we'll come to the flood. So the question before us is, first of all, how did this tradition enter the Bible? How did it become part of biblical tradition? Now, this is not an easy question, or not an there's no easy answer to this question. So some Christians believe that when Moses went up the mountain and God talked to him and gave the 10 commandments to Moses, that God dictated all these things to Moses and he wrote it down. Now, I believe that is possible. I will not say it's not possible. But I think the more logical way to understand these things is that Moses wrote these things, but it was part of a tradition that was handed down to him from the fathers. And this is why the primeval history, this chapters 1 to 11, has a very different character from the rest of the book of Genesis. And this is quite interesting. There are many ways to distinguish the way that is presented. There's so many differences between the primeval history and the rest of Genesis, the patriarchal tradition. So it's clearly the sources, I believe, is different. That's the reason why it's so different. In the case of the patriarchal tradition, we have stories from the time of Abram and after that. And I believe those stories were already written down during that period, the Abrahamic period. What is interesting is when one reads through the book of Genesis regarding the story of Abram, one of the most important things is the amount of oracles God spoke so many
Willie,
times.
Can I just interject there? If you look at the Genesis flow, where would you insert the Book of Enoch? It's pre-flood.
The Book of Enoch is the person, Enoch.
Let's say the person of Enoch.
Yeah, the person of Enoch. So what the Bible says, that Enoch is the seventh from Adam, and there were 10 generations till the flood. So he's just before the flood, and then after the flood, there's a long period and history. And I believe there was a certain tradition that developed surrounding this person of Enoch, which was eventually written down in the 2nd century or so before Christ in the Book of Enoch. So this is within Jewish tradition. So what I've been talking about is long before we how did Enoch in the first place enter the biblical tradition? So what first regarding his origins, before discussing how his tradition was delivered down in Jewish circles. So what I wanted to say about Abram is during that same period of Abram, we find in the city of Mari that oracles of the gods were written down. And the reason is when the gods spoke, it was extremely important, and they wrote it down. So we expect the same for Abram. When God spoke, he would have written it down. It was so important, he would have written it down. And also the context, because we find the same thing in Mari. There were the contexts where the oracles were given, but also the stories of the kings. They were related. So that's why I believe the Abrahamic stories were written down already during Abram's own lifetime. But Abram brought with him all the stories about his prehistory of his people, much older. Take, for example, we've talked about Adam. Now, Adam in history depends on the text you're using. But I, for example, believe the Septuagint gives the best correlation with secular history. It actually gives a very good correspondence. So it's very much in line with history. And that's important because it supports the historicity of the Bible. Now, Adam, within the context of the Septuagint, is placed in about 5,500 BC. And that's about very much the same period as Adapa. So I've already talked about Adam, Adapa, two personages from two different traditions. One delivered down in biblical tradition, the other in Sumerian tradition. Now, Enoch also lived before the flood. Now, the flood or the deluge can also be dated in terms of secular history. And we'll talk about it next time, but let's just get a date there. Let's say about 3,400 BC. Again, according to the Septuagint, and also very much it can be confirmed in secular history, and I will be talking about next time about that. So Enoch is before that time. So that means we're talking about earlier than 3,400 BC. Let's say 3,200 BC. That's very long ago, very, very long ago. The earliest written texts, or let me put it differently, the earliest writing only came later.
Yep.
And the earliest text is in about 2,400 BC. That's more than 1,000 years later. So that just gives you an idea how old the story of Enoch is, and has been delivered down throughout history. Long before people wrote it down, Enoch lived. Nobody could have written it down when it happened because the people in that period didn't write. They didn't know about writing. Writing developed later on. So his story was only written down much later. So this is a different kind of stories. And this is what makes the primeval history in Genesis so different. It's because it contains stories that's much older than those that had historically been written down during the period when it happened. It's old stories that have been delivered down throughout a very long history. And this is also how we can see it in the style and many other ways to understand, to see it in this way. So it's important to understand it's an old story. It's important to understand it had been handed down in the Abrahamic family for a long time before it entered biblical tradition. Before Moses, I believe, wrote it down. So long before Moses, there's a prehistory. It goes back to Abram. Probably, I personally believe, and I think we can make a good case for that, that the story of Enoch was probably written down the first time. Well, not maybe the first time, but most likely already during the time of Abram, and most possibly even earlier. So it's
Willie,
been written down earlier, but it's an old story.
maybe if it's fine to bring it in now, you can give us some light on the correspondence between the story of Enoch and Etana.
Yeah, so there's a close correspondence between the two stories. Now, what I'm not saying that Jewish tradition borrowed from Babylonian tradition. So I'm not saying, as we find in liberal theology, that these stories were current in Mesopotamia and the Jews borrowed those stories. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there were two very old parallel traditions going back to the same historical personages. And this personage is called in Sumerian tradition Etana. It just means he that went to God. It's literally what the name means. He who went to God. Now, the story of Etana is quite fascinating. We are told that an eagle took Etana on his wings up towards the heaven of the supreme God. This is clearly very much the same story that we find in the Bible. Okay, the imagery are slightly different. Now, let's first have a look at the eagle. Now, the eagle and the context in the Etana story is very has elements similar to what we've already discussed in the Garden of Eden story. And I've already mentioned that the cherubim, the biblical cherubim, agrees with eagles in ancient Sumerian tradition. So from a biblical point of view, and a later reformulating these things, this would have been a cherubim that took Etana, or then Enoch, to heaven. Which is quite fascinating way to understand it, because the Bible doesn't really say a lot about it. It just says, we read that he walked with God and he was no more because God took him. And later on, we read in the New Testament that he was taken bodily to heaven. So here we find an interesting way that it's described. Might be, one might say, slightly primitive. But I think at the same time, it describes a beautiful reality that he was taken by this, one could say a cherubim, or maybe in this case it refers to the Spirit of God, but he was taken to heaven. And what is also interesting is that in the Sumerian king list, there are quite a lot of early dynasties that had been documented in this king list. And one of them is the dynasty of Kish. That's from where Etana was. He was the first king, according to Sumerian tradition. He was the very first king that ever ruled. He was the first king of Kish, and he was the first king among men. It's fascinating.
Yes.
And that is why he was remembered as a very important person. He was a Semite. He ruled in Kish, and he was the first king among men. The scepter that was first lie in heaven at the feet of the Most High God was given to Enoch, to Etana, and he became the first king among men. And in the king list, he is actually, regarding the kings of Kish, he is the 7th in the list, exactly as we find in biblical tradition.
Yes.
And in the oldest king list, the Earth 3 king list, Sumerian king list, that's much older than the well-known king lists which date from the Eastern Larsa period. In that, we find that the dynasty of Kish is actually right at the top. So when you start reading, it's the dynasty of Kish, and then when you come down, you come to Enoch. And as I've said in the Sumerian king list, he is the 7th personage, not in all versions, but in some of the versions.
Willie,
So this is exactly in accordance with the Bible. It says that he's the 7th from Adam, from the beginning, from the first documented person of importance. Yes. Yeah.
Carel, you wanted to ask a question.
I'm sorry. Enoch is really a very fascinating figure to me, but the article you've written, Willie, is also very revealing. That the Bible teaches us that in those days, the people got much older. And if you look at those king lists, it reveals the very same thing. it is very interesting. But also the person of Enoch.
Let me just say something about the age, Carel,
Okay.
before you proceed.
Good. Right.
This is a difficult question. Why do we find in the Bible that these first personages reach at ages? And some people would like to use that argument to say, but the Bible cannot be true. But the point of the matter is the only other document where we find that is in the Sumerian king list. And there we also find these old ages and long reigns. And in my work, I've shown that the biblical author writing his history in the case of Genesis, the literary style he was using was that used for the king list. The historiography that he's using. So all of us are people of our times, and we use the literary styles of our day. And he used that style to some extent, and he shares the same tradition. And that's why, although we can't explain the old ages, this is actually an extremely important argument for that this is a very old tradition, and that this tradition goes back not to the exilic or post-exilic period, as some liberal theologians would like it to be, but to a very early stage in Israel's history, because the only related document where we find not only this, but other similar characteristics is the Sumerian king list. And that dates from about 1800 BC. That's about the time of Abraham. Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, so these king lists and also these stories, these ancient stories of Adapa and Itana, which are extra biblical stories, just confirm that the Bible is not fairy tales. It is rooted both in the same ancient tradition. But what I wanted to say about Enoch, he's a fascinating figure because in the Bible, I think there are just about 2 people I can think of now who were taken up bodily into heaven. It was Enoch and Elijah, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
But what was also, when I read again about Enoch, I saw that his son, Enoch was about 365 years old when he was taken up into heaven. 1 year for each day of the year. But his son became the oldest person in the Bible, which is Methuselah. 969 years. And it also, for me, I can see that he was blessed. His children were blessed, although God took him early. But what really fascinates me is the person of Enoch. And in these extra biblical traditions, I think at another place I read, you also mentioned something more of the person of Enoch. He was, you said he was a king. I was thinking he was like David. He was really a king who honored God, who walked with God, but he had influence in his society. He was a spiritual man, and maybe later on, as we will see, he also even had influence among the angels because they wanted him to intercede for them. So Enoch was really a man living very closely to God, and that's very fascinating to me.
He was a fascinating figure from a very early stage in Mesopotamian tradition. We find during the Akkadian period, that was during the Akkadian Empire, that's about, let's say, 370 BC for the next 200 years after that was the period of the Akkadian Empire. Now, the Akkadians were Semites, great Semitic kings, and they also traced their own descent back through the house of Kish. And most likely the founder of the Akkadian Empire, Sargon the Great, he was most likely from a Kishite descent. One of the kings of Kish was his father or his forefathers came from there. So he's in the same tradition, actually, as Etana. And during the Akkadian period, we see that depictions of Etana appear in society. So the oldest depictions of Etana riding on the eagle is from about 2300 BC. That's also just in about the same time that the first texts appear. The first text is slightly earlier. That's about 2500, 2400 BC. And about 2300, we have depictions of Etana. So this was an old, really old story. And exactly as we know, because he goes back to the period before the flood, before the deluge. What is also interesting is in biblical tradition, the two most important persons in the early story is Adam, and then the next one is Enoch, and then the flood. We find exactly the same in Sumerian tradition. The first person was Adapa. He had a very special relationship with the Most High God. And then after him came Etana, and he was taken to God, to the Most High God, should I say, by the eagle. Now, dating Etana and deciding on where to fit him in is a very long argument. I can't enter into that, but I've written some articles on that, which is also available, for example, on Ancient Origins and so forth. Also on my blog, I've written some articles on that. But anyhow, so what is interesting is that we have the same two persons, Adapa, Etana, and then the deluge. We have Adam and Enoch and the deluge, and we have the same or very similar stories about them. Obviously, the stories are different because it's two different traditions that have been handed down for a very long period. Now, some people would ask, but which one of these two is correct? But this is, in a certain sense, not the right answer, the right question to ask. Because Moses, when he took this base material, he also reworked it. We've already seen, for example, in the garden story, how he made use of this material and other material in his story, and he reused it. The whole story about the snake and the temptation, there's elements of historicity, but there's other elements clearly where Moses is trying to say, this is what God forbids, this is not allowed. So there's elements that Moses incorporated in the story. So in that sense, it's not real history as we understand history in nowadays. You know, that was not the way that it was written. So there was definitely elements taken from history. These are historical personages, in my opinion. The stories are very similar. But the way it's packaged in the Bible, by Moses especially, he had a particular purpose also in his writing, because he wanted to convey, for example, with creation, we've already seen, he's making an argument for the Sabbath. And with the story last time, we've spoken quite extensively about the fall and about God preparing clothes for them and all these things, and how Moses actually used this type of God, killing an animal, clothing them, as an example of God, the divine model for the sacrifices. So there are quite a lot of things that Moses actually, he uses the material. And he is also writing a story, but he's not writing just plain history in a certain very, as we understand history. This is not the right way to see this.
And I just wanted to add there, really, I mean, we've had extensive discussions around all of these topics, and the snake and the tree, and you know, the female form with the body of a serpent in the roots, and the eagle. I would just recommend that if this is the first time you listen to this podcast, actually stop, go back and listen to the previous ones, because there's progression that is very, very important.
What is also fascinating to me is the name, or are the names of God in these different traditions. And also Etana, his name, and An, the god An, which was similar to the Semitic god El. And in the name Etana, it is so clear. Maybe, Willie, you can just say something about that.
Yeah, so we'll come back to the the origins of the Hebrew God, to put it like that. But in these ancient stories, in Sumer, the name for the Most High God used is An. Now, An is quite interesting because the word An means supreme, high, heaven. So An actually means the Most High God. And this, we find something similar in Hebrew tradition. El Eloah, the Most High God. That's the Father of the gods. For example, in Psalm 82, he's depicted as the Father of the gods in the Council of the Gods. This is exactly the role of An. He's the Father of the gods in the Council of the Gods. So the similarities are really deep. We're not just talking about superficial similarities. But this An is definitely a Sumerian form. The question is whether Itana originally worshipped An in the name called, say, An, or was it El? El is the typical Semitic form. Now, in my opinion, An and El were just the same. It's two names. It's like if I read the Hebrew Bible, the French Bible every day, actually, and there's do. So now it's not a debate on is it God or what is the name of God, and you find guys that makes a big issue about these things. But the point of the matter is that both mean the same thing. So it's just An and El were very much the same. It was just in this, for the Semites, it was El, the father of the gods, and for the early Sumerians, they used the word An, and in reference to El, the father of the gods. So it's the Most High God. But you must also remember, and this is also something I would like to accentuate. You know, we think that in that early period, the people had very much the same thinking that we find in the Bible, but that's not true. Remember, the Bible were written much like the Moses is typically dated to about 1400 BC. Now that's about 400 years later than Abram. That's about more than 1,000 years later than the flood. So there are long periods that we're talking about here. And the concept of God has developed. It has changed through time. So with Moses, for the first time, the name Yahweh was introduced. Moses actually stated very clearly, and I don't want to go too deep into these things now, but he states and he says that the fathers, they worship me under the name El Shaddai. But now I reveal myself to you, Moses, as Yahweh. So the name Yahweh wasn't known before that. And the way that we understand God, Elohim, the term Elohim, the same thing. It's a Mosaic term. We don't find it in earlier tradition. So what we must remember is with Moses, there came a certain understanding of God's, who he is, his being, etc. That was a new revelation, which was not revealed previously. And the further back we go in history, the more primitive, in a certain sense, things get. The gods are all over the place. Although we have the supreme God, God, father of the gods, and so forth, we have many other gods. It was a different way of thinking about things. And we should remember this. We shouldn't predict
I just wanted
post-Mosaic world back into the pre-Mosaic world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to add to that, because sometimes people that criticize the Bible say that it's almost as if, you know, it was a book that was just created at some stage, you know, prior to Christ. So it's loose standing from prehistory, but that
definitely
is
not
completely incorrect. And I think that's also why we do look at the prehistory to tie these two together, and especially the way God features in prehistory, and then you know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, the Bible is a product from the world, the ancient Middle Eastern world. And we can trace it back to Moses, for example, the Pentateuch. But as I've said, the pre-Bible history, chapters 1 to 11 in Genesis, that goes back was most likely written down about in the time of Abraham. And even the patriarchal tradition goes back before Moses. Moses often mentions, I'm using the book of the generations of. He doesn't say I am using it, but he writes the book of the generations. So clearly he's using material, which he orders according to the material that he has received. And then this is even, as I've said, this pre-Bible history goes back even long before Abraham. So there were most likely earlier sources, written sources even, and it was an old tradition. So, but with this tradition evolving, at the same time, the concept of God and the way that God revealed himself evolved. With Abraham, God revealed himself in a way that he did not do before Abraham. Before Abraham, we can call it the age of ignorance. People were ignorant. They didn't know. They do know about the supreme God, and they worship him, but they also worship other gods. You know, it was a different period. But then, slowly but steadily, God revealed himself to Abraham in a totally different way, and eventually to Moses. So there's progression in the way that God revealed himself. So there's a progressive revelation of God and the nature of God until Christ came, and we have a full revelation of God in the person of Jesus Christ. And as a reader, we should take these things into account when we read the Bible. The Bible did not fall out of heaven one day.
Absolutely.
You know, yes. It had a prehistory. It came into existence in an existing world, you know, and these things are important when we study the Bible.
And it's so important to emphasize this with current Christians, to really emphasize that, because it also points to the miraculousness of the Bible. Without a doubt. I don't know, did you want to add anything to that, Carel? I'm putting you on the spot now.
No, but I would like us to maybe say something about Enoch and the Book of Enoch as well.
Yes, I think that's a good point to, and then to also mention that it's First Enoch. That's the book, because there are other versions out there that's more, you know, occultic, if I can say that.
But I just want to say something again about the person of Enoch. The Bible does refer to him a few times. In Jude, even in the New Testament, he's mentioned. Enoch, the seventh, Jude 1:14, the seventh generation from Adam. He prophesied and said, "Look, I saw the Lord coming with 10,000 of his holy ones." So it seems he even saw the end times coming so far away. But Enoch, I once heard a sermon when I was still a student in Stellenbosch University. There was a person who preached about Enoch, and it really touched me. And he challenged us to have the kind of relationship with God as Enoch had, a person walking with God in such a way that one day God told Enoch, do you really want to go home to your old place here on earth? Why don't you just come to me? And Enoch said, it's fine. And he went to stay with God. It is so amazing, you know. And I really, I'm hungry for that kind of deep, deep walk with God, which we saw in Enoch. But as these old history reveals also, he was a man of influence on various levels in society. And it is fascinating when you're reading in that first book of Enoch that, you know, he was asked to intercede on behalf of the angels. And that's not such a strange thought, because Paul says in Corinthians, the letter to the Corinthians, that we will even judge angels. God gives us a position to reign with him somehow through Christ. But when you read it, and you know, when he saw something of the glory of God in heaven, it's described in such a wonderful way. that it really, it stirs something in your heart, in your spirit, that this man walked with God. The Bible touches on it because it is important, but we don't have much detail about it. So I'm glad that we can find something in the Book of Enoch. How factual it is, I don't know. I'm not. Maybe Willie, you can help with how those books into existence. I don't know.
So this is interesting about the Book of Enoch, is that it's referred to in the Bible, but it's not in the Bible.
Yes.
Very few books outside the Bible are being referred to in the Bible. In the New Testament, quoting from, let's say, inspired source outside the Bible, this is the only place. We have other places, for example, Paul quoting philosophers in his arguments or so. But this is the only place where we find this. The question is, why was the Book of Enoch not included in the Bible? Now, in my way of thinking, the Book of Enoch was written quite late. I think it was about the 3rd to the 2nd century BC. So it was not really, the book didn't go back to Enoch. Enoch did not write the book. But there must have been a tradition about Enoch that had been delivered down through the centuries, oral tradition in Jewish circles. And this tradition must have played a role in the eventual coming together of the Book of Enoch and in it being written. So this author here, Jude, the brother of Jesus, he quotes from 1 verse 7 in the book of Jude, the first book, as Tobias just accentuated.
Yes.
So I believe this particular verse in the book of Enoch represented a very old tradition. But the same is not true for all elements of the book of Enoch. So I do not believe that the book of Enoch is divinely inspired. That's why it's not in the Bible. But there's elements in this tradition that is being referred to here and that we can accept as going back to a very early stage in history. But I cannot accept that the book of Enoch itself is divinely inspired.
But Willie, do you agree that it does, if you look at the book of Enoch, it does give insight into certain references that are made in the Bible? And that's where the value lies.
The other topic, or the main topic of the book of Enoch, is the fallen angels.
There you go.
And the Nephilim. And this is actually also found in Genesis 6 verse 4. And we'll return to this after our discussion of the deluge. We'll come back and we'll have a discussion on the Nephilim, because we read that the Nephilim were on the earth before and after the deluge. We'll focus on the period after the deluge. But this is the main topic in the book of Enoch. And it's fascinating. I mean, I've been studying the Nephilim for many, many years. I'm writing a book about it in extra biblical tradition. So it's not the tradition. The Bible doesn't say a lot. There's one verse in the Bible. But there's a lot to be said about it outside the Bible. But we'll come back to that and we'll discuss it in due time.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm very excited about that. So just a little side point. I made a couple of notes prior to, and I see in the Sumerian king list, he's referred to as Enmendurana, and the name means chief of the powers of the Duranki, which means the meeting place of heaven and earth, and literally the bond of above and below. So it's just really fascinating. It's just bringing the above and below, that concept together, and the
Duranki. That's very much An and Ki you find in that name. I've just discussed An, which is just another word for heaven. Ki is earth, the bond of heaven and earth. And that's very similar to the ladder of Jacob, for example, going up and down. And also Jesus refers to the angels coming up and down. So this, let's say, connection, cosmic connection, towards from the heavens towards the earth is very old, and it's quite closely related to the cosmic tree that we discussed, I think about
Yes.
a month ago or so in one of our discussions.
So same concept.
Yeah,
well,
and that was associated mostly with Napu. That was the center of the layout of ancient Sumer. Very important ancient religious city. But anyhow, a bit of information.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, we sort of have come close to the end. Carel, do you have any final thoughts or anything else to add?
Absolutely.
There you go.
Let us walk with God as Enoch did.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt.
Yeah, and Carel, what you have also said, going back to Etana and he being a king and having great influence, we should also in this world be light and salt. We should make a difference. We should not retreat from this world.
Yes.
Go and sit somewhere on an island, not engage with the world. I don't believe this is the right way to go about. We should engage with the world. We should win people for Jesus in this world. We should let our light shine in the world. And I think this is an example of Enoch. He did exactly this. He was in government. That's now when we think in terms of Etana and the equivalent tradition in Sumer. And we can, from that side of the story, we can also learn a few things. And this is that we as Christians should also engage. And we should not be shy to let our light shine, but the way that we do it and the manner in which we live, that's important. Some Christians, I've seen it on Facebook and other social media, sometimes the way that they approach things and the arguments, it's not the way that Christ would do it. And I'm sorry to say, but this is not the right way to go about. But we should engage. But we should always engage with this in mind, the way that Christ did it. That we are bearers of light. And we should bear his love in the world. And the way that we engage, the way that we answer things, the way that we on the social media, I know that's just, there's a lot of fighting going on all the time and people feel they must defend stuff and so forth. Doesn't matter, but the point of the matter is do it in such a way that it's consistent with Christian living. Like Enoch.
Absolutely. It's something that I've noticed as well is that people have a tendency to dismiss things right off the bat. There's no thought around anything. And I had someone tell me the other day around something completely separate from this, but that's nonsense. But there's no valid argument. So it's based in emotion. And I think as Christians, we need to be a bit more analytical, a bit more thinking. We need to ponder the word of God. And when we engage and even engage each other, we need to do it in a respectful, but also a very bold way. And not just sort of hide in a corner.
Yeah, and what we are actually doing in this program, we're giving Christians tools. Because we present this part of biblical tradition and the biblical story in such a way that it shows that the Bible is reliable. It shows that we can trust the Bible. It shows that the Bible didn't fall from heaven to repeat that phrase, but we can trust it, and it's grounded and rooted in history. So when we talk with skeptical people, the things we're talking about in these different conversations, it'll help you a lot to really be salt and light, and to make a good argument for the historicity and trustworthiness of Scripture.
And I think it's foundational. So it's really, really important that we study these things. And as you said, it gives us really solid, worthwhile tools to engage people around ourselves, whether it's secular or fellow Christians.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I really want to thank you guys. This has been another, I didn't say a lot in this one, but I'm just absolutely fascinated. I was just, you know, really engrossed in the whole conversation. So thank you, Carel. Thank you, Willie. And to our listeners, again, if you guys have any questions or any comments, feel free to engage us on the core website or on the Bible GPS as well. And there's a Facebook page that you guys can use. I will post the links, and I'll have a discussion with Willie around which of those articles I can post on the Facebook page as well. That will be some additional support. But yes, thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, Levi. Thank you, listeners. Blessings.